So, Steve, you sent me a topic that I was very much like piqued my interests because I know it's based on some research you've done and some case studies that you've made. And this is the title, I think, of your most recent case study. And then I'll just allow you to then guide us between like maybe what was the inspiration for starting it, like what drew you in. Maybe the stories are tied to it, but um, so the case study was challenging gender roles and expectations in outdoor field experiences. So what was that? What was the energy? What led you towards that topic? And I'll let you run with it.
This is just kind of what has guided my work for pretty much my entire career. So, and I was even thinking about when you had reached out about, I was reminded of a story way back in my first facilitation experience. I worked at a residential summer camp with the Scouts. So we had this group of Cub Scouts out, and there was this one little guy that was really struggling to get up the wall. We had a climbing wall on our tower, and his mom actually started shouting at him and was calling him an derogatory term for a resilient body part, which I always think is fascinating that we use that to show weakness, but it's actually a very resilient body part. Thanks for getting the reference. And was like causing this pretty huge thing. So thankfully our manager got this woman off site, but the kid was so scared at that moment because he had that pressure of disappointing his parents, disappointing everybody, being shut out against all his peers. I went up because we couldn't just lower him because he was like had the death grip on the wall. And so I went up, tried to talk to him. I was next to him trying to do a pick-off rescue. And then he started, because he was freaking out so much, started like unscrewing my carabiners. And I was just like, whoa, 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 whoa. And then was thankfully able to get him down after that incident. But that just kind of sparked this idea of like, how do these gender roles and these expectations show up, and how are they reinforced throughout this our society more broadly? So like Bell Hooks talks a lot about this in her book. She has a lot of good books that I recommend, but The Will to Change, which talks about the system of patriarchy and how these influences can negatively impact our reactions as we go throughout. So that was kind of this little moment, but I wasn't thinking about gender or even going into research at this time. Like I wasn't even thinking about the career I'm in now because I was in high school. And then as I was working in outdoor education, I was noticing these kind of roles show up throughout my experience. So noticing that the women would immediately start cooking or taking up into these tasks when we're on a backpacking trip. And then the guys would just be kind of hanging out, sitting around, often struggling to make a fire because I got to make a fire because I'm tough, and then would often not be able to do it right away because anyway, that's a whole other aside. So then that got me thinking about how can we be intentional about shaping outdoor experiences to start to kind of challenge some of these gender roles, because I've worked in higher ed most of my life, and I've facilitated workshops on violence prevention. I've been a Green Dot facilitator, which is a national movement that talks about bystander intervention training. And when I'd be teaching different groups, particularly like fraternity groups, they'd start to be in this mindset of a defensive posture. So very reactive to the situation, immediately that perception of, oh, this is this feminist person that's going to attack me in my manhood, and then would start to kind of retaliate without being open to listening to those concepts. So I found in those outdoor experiences where these kind of roles can play out in a less reactive way, like we're not talking about sexual assault and things like that. We're talking about some of those core issues that then lead to that overt violence that perpetuates our society.
It sounds like, you're touching on some points that are very relatable to me. Even so, I reflect back that we just went camping and I went straight into like, I'm going to make the fire.
Yeah.
Now, I hope that I used to teach survival skills
Yeah.
classes, so I think I'm pretty good at it, but like there is a point of like, all right, that's my job. And only recently I had my daughter help me, and when we went, she just made the fire herself and she was so proud. And then I was really like, interesting that I defaulted to wanting to supervise or be there, and realizing
Right.
that, she's 8, she could figure that stuff out. I can be the boundary point, but I find myself defaulting into this. How have you, in your career, like, I would also say from your education perspective, now teaching this stuff,
Hmm.
what do you see when your students are coming through in terms of like defaulting to those? Do you have to still, are you still in that mindset of having to remind people of those components, or do you highlight them in the moment? How do you address those as they present themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it does kind of depend on some of the group dynamics. So I've actually noticed a trend, and this actually started when I participated in the Knowles South, the outdoor educator course. It was this like maybe 15 years ago at this point. I'm like getting old. I'm like, where am I at this in my career?
I
But
know.
I remember I participated in that course, and our instructors actually noted that it was predominantly participants who identified as women in the experience, and they're like, "Oh, this is like pretty different." So I think having that experience, it was three individuals who identify as men, and I'm trying to get my numbers right. I'm like doing all the names in my head now, and then 8 women. So it was like where we were in this minority, which was interesting. But then even some of the expectations of like, what's that framework of, do we have more of a base knowledge, where the men tended to be looked at more as like in that leadership role oftentimes. And so, and we talked about it a lot, and I think the instructors were really good. So on the backpacking portion, we had one man and one woman, so that was a good dynamic. And then for the climbing section, we actually had 2 women and one man, so it was like a really good dynamic that reflected that. But it was interesting how it played out. And then I noticed, and this is kind of speaks to the trends more broadly in higher education, where I've noticed a lot more women are the ones that sign up for our trips and experiences. So I've actually just got back from the Grand Canyon yesterday, and we had 50 students on a bus trip. What wouldn't be what we talk about? Well, I think that's like another masculinity concept of how do we define adventure. Like,
Mm.
okay, because a lot of people are like, oh, you just took a bus of students to a national park and you're taking pictures and you didn't even do any hiking. But it was like a really good experience because a lot of the students had, even if they live in Arizona, they've never been to the park before. But even this trip, it was, I think there were maybe 4 out of the 50 that identified as men. So even that like desire for involvement. And I think, and this is one of the things that I've been kind of looking at is, do women feel as though they need to be more involved so they can build up their resume because of those expectations, where we have a lot of privilege in our society where men
Hmm.
will be looked at as, oh, you're the leader, or okay, you got this degree, so we'll hire you, or even how we present in spaces. So I'm wondering if that's why we see that more women are showing up in these opportunities to be involved, or if it is because we're socialized to have more of that community aspect. So, and I think that's one of those
Hmm.
critical points that I really try to frame in my work is I'm not attacking masculinity. I don't even really use the term patriarchy a lot because that's kind of a triggering term for a lot of folks. So I
Hmm.
like to say harmful expressions of masculinity, because masculinity itself isn't inherently bad. It's just how we're socialized to present that those forms of dominance, control, etc. So I don't think I really answered the question. I'm just kind of thinking out loud about
Yeah.
some pretty broad concepts of what's influencing this involvement and how do we see that playing out. So I think that's been helpful, that a lot of my experiences have been shaped by women in leadership roles, and then also getting to mentor a lot of women who have now, like, I have a former student who's working at the state level in Pennsylvania on outdoor recreation initiatives, and she had never camped before. She just decided to sign up on one spring break trip and was like, I want to do something, and then had developed a lot of really cool skills. And I know I always tear up. I'm like, it's so great. Like, see these success stories of somebody who never even thought of themselves in an outdoor leadership role, and then identified that they had the skills, strengths, and abilities to do so, and the passion for connecting more people with our more than human kin.
How do you interact with that, being the lead of a program or the educator
Mm-hmm.
involved, and yet identifying as a man, and also the way that sometimes we present ourselves in the outdoor field? The reason I'm saying this is because I think not only from this perspective, but I often feel about the professionalism sometimes of our, or the expectation of our industry. I was recently talking to a mountain guide, and he talked about being a climbing bum as sometimes the way that people
Right.
look at him in the industry. So I think about
Mm-hmm.
legitimacy for gender. I also think legitimacy in terms of the industry. We're sort of like hampered by lots of. I love the idea of like socialized gender norms because I think about that. Right? How does the outward world see us? How do we see ourselves? And then do we find ourselves conforming to type to feel like we need to fit in? Because I sometimes feel like that for myself. Like, do I represent the industry that well?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? So I'm clashing with that consistently. What's your viewpoints on some of that?
Well,
Kind of
that's
rambled at you, but
yeah, no, no, I love it because I'm like really empathizing with you with this because like I always make this joke now that I have this adventure dad aesthetic where I'll wear like the Hawaiian shirts or like the button ups, and yeah, wearing the baseball hat. I grew out my beard, which 14 years ago, but I used to like do different things. Like I used to have a handlebar mustache for a while. And when I was in undergrad, I was actually my goal was to be a cool hunter, and I wanted to work in the fashion industry. And my senior capstone project was actually looking at the growth of the men's fashion industry. And then when I found myself realizing that tricking people into buying stuff they didn't need wasn't congruent with my values, I
mm,
then got involved in these experiential leadership programs. I had some great mentors in undergrad that kind of guided me towards higher ed. And then as I like started to recognize how students were interacting with the growth of technology, I reflected back on some of my experiences, and that's when I went back to that outdoor experience. But when I was new in my career, I was constantly trying to fit in because I didn't do a traditional outdoor rec program. I was doing certification. I was paying for a lot of certifications out of my pocket because I didn't get those in my undergrad experience because I didn't realize I can do a degree in this, which is one of the reasons I
mm-hmm,
ended up in this field. So I think that's a really important point is even like how do we present ourselves in spaces and like bring in and like create that true inclusion. So I think that that's something that I critique a lot in our industry is we say, yeah, the outdoors is for everybody, but we think about what are some of these barriers. Like I was even yesterday, I was like on the bus because you take different shuttles to different points along the Grand Canyon, and everything was in English, and I was next to this German family, and I used my very poor German to be like, okay, this is where we're at. But even that space of like,
mm-hmm,
hey, like, where are we in this space where we have a lot of students who predominantly speak Spanish? So, like, being able to like adapt that and be aware of that context of like what that fit is, and I recognize that as like being the quote unquote leader of the program. Like, I even had this experience at a university where I had two really great undergraduate students who had been involved with our program for 3 years. They kind of had a progressive experience where they were developing skills. They were leading multi-day expeditions on their own. They were handling rescues on our challenge course, doing all sorts of things, had that high level skill set, but they were also thinking innovatively about programming. So they were partnering with our wellness promotion office and our Center for Women and Gender Equity. And so they were going on these planning meetings. They wanted to create the stand up paddleboard women's empowerment series where they would go through issues of like body image and different things, and they would talk to me one on one about like, hey, we have this idea, what do you think about this? But I intentionally didn't go to the planning meetings, and then I actually had um, uh, I think an assistant director in the wellness promotion office say like, "Oh, why aren't you coming to these meetings? Like, we need your professional opinion." And I was like, "Well, these are two professionals." And she's like, "No, like a professional." And I was like, "Well, why do you need a white man to tell you what women need to feel empowered when there's two women here that have the skills, have the talent, have the passion, and I fully trust their ability. And I'm just going to sign off my portion of the check to pay for the funds and make sure the paddle boards are available for the programs." Like, because that's all I really need to do in this moment. And like the person who does identify as a woman was like shocked by this, because it was this like thought where it's a subliminal thing of like, yeah, I'm
Mm.
in this position, I have this title, and then part of it is my identity in that space. And then there was actually a student who isn't just worked in our rec center who like kind of observed the interaction because they're coming out of the conference room, and she was like, "Wow, that was like really awesome, thank you for that," because like my voice is often
Mm-hmm.
silenced. And I was like, so I think that that's what we can do. That was a really roundabout answer to like
Mm-hmm.
how we work in this space as we hold some of these privileged identities, is how we can use that privilege to kind of challenge those dynamics where we are going to be looked to, our voice is often going to be looked to with more value, but so we can kind of flip the lens back and say like, this is what I'm observing. What do we think about this? How is this playing out? How does this make you feel like when
Mm-hmm.
you have a white man that's like, "Hey, yeah, this is the way you should do things," when it's your lived experience. And that's what you're trying to explore, so we can get at that holistic health and well-being. I do think we're on the cusp of it. I think we're getting there. I think there is still a little bit of a fear to challenge and go like full force and like critically examining what are traditional. And I know you just had an episode on this, on the history of so I don't want to reframe what a woman spoke about, because that's another common issue. But I think that that's an important context to kind of guide this, is like some of the origins are like that traditional, well, actually not traditional, like the colonial concept of conquest, and like I'm demonstrating this grit and resiliency, which one could argue is this kind of masculine trait where, but then that gets into that harmful factor if I have to dominate it and conquer nature. And that's something that I even grapple with in my work in the challenge course side of things. So I kind of dabble in every piece of outdoor just because I love it all. But and that's something that I often grapple with, is we are creating this built environment, we're modifying the environment, where how do we intentionally encourage people to have a healthy interaction with our greater community, which includes our more than human. And I use the term more than human to reinforce that humans are a part of nature, we're not apart from nature, which I think is a really important context as well, is how we redefine that. So I think it is that role modeling piece, but also how we redefine relationships. So like I actually learned this from one of my mentors, where, because when I started in the industry, it was like, you gotta complete every initiative, you gotta complete every element, and like work through that fear and like push yourself and hit that level. I was at one point, he actually said like, some of the biggest impacts are when people say no, and say, recognize like, this is like the capacity I hit, I got everything out of it, and then
Mm-hmm.
we honor that. And then I know like Denise Benton talks a lot about this. Like one of my favorite stories is like when she was belaying at REI, like way back early in her career, and the dad was pushing his daughter to climb the wall, and like she said no, and she's like, I forget exactly what she said, but it's like, don't you want your daughter to be able to say no and not be pressured into things? And like, so even like those concepts I think are playing out more in our industry, and
Mm-hmm.
like thinking more about like, especially thinking about like the mental health side of things, and like doing more mindful approaches, not just I'm gonna through hike this trail. I'm gonna do a 5 mile hike and get to a nice campsite, and then we'll do some guided activities. We'll do some reflective activities. We'll have more of that community building. Like I know the first trip I left after COVID, it was actually a paddleboard trip, and I was working with the GA who was like really excited to teach all these skills, and we had our lesson plan with like, we're going to do this stroke and we're going to do this rescue and like go through all these things because it was like an intro to paddleboard course was like how it was advertised. And then the students just were like, oh, I'm finally with other humans and I just want to like sit here. It's a beautiful day. And so they were just sitting on the paddle boards talking to each other in the middle of a lake. And at first he was kind of stressed out about it. And I was like, no, like this is what they need in this moment. Like, let's embrace this and adapt and not think that we have to hit all of these standards and check boxes. Cause I think that that is one of those issues, especially with like certifications and all that, is how do we find that balance of making sure that people are safe in programs, but then on that same token, I think we put so much on the technical skills that we neglect a lot of those human skills and thinking critically
Mhm.
about how systemic forms of oppression influence people's safety as they interact in our programs.
How should this impact and influence the stuff we've been talking about? The way that we as males in the field teach our students. But you're impacting with a lot of students. I'm impacting with a lot of
Mm-hmm.
students. And so not just role modeling. I think we could talk about some of these subjects too. But what else maybe tangible can we do with our students?
Yeah, no, and I love that point of like bringing that critique of the teachable moment. And one of the things that like I really appreciate about from High Five, and I got this when I did the course manager a few years ago, but the story of the Mohawk Ironworkers Walk, because I every time I do this element now, I bring in that story because I talk about, you know, we're good intention where we're critiquing it. So like the first course I worked at, it was shortened as Mohawk work, Mohawk Walk. And then I was like, oh, we can't call it that because that's misappropriating, like do it using all these myths around like the indigenous peoples being able to like balance on things. And then we erase this direct contribution. So I talk about that in I taught an adventure programming course and we got really deep into that. But also like whenever I just have a group for a 3 hour program and we get to that element and I would talk about that as that's one of the issues we have more broadly is in a society is that lack of critical thought is because we're not that's like not what the system's designed to do. And that's really what I see of the role of experiential learning is providing that space where we can develop a genuine connection with others with by reducing some of those barriers, some of those like we have our phones or and like those shields that we can present. We can kind of have these insular communities, but we can connect at that genuine level, but actually take the time to examine those thoughts. So like I'm teaching a community development class right now, and like the first class session I'm in this very structured classroom that's lecture style. The tables are
Mhm.
have cords connected, and I was like trying to rearrange the room so we could form into a circle. And then a few of the students were coming in, they're like, what's going on here? Like, and then they were sitting at the chair, the tables like facing the front of the screen, even as I created a circle in the back with like some ropes and other things and activities. And I was just kind of like, you know, like what does this say about our structures and like how we're socialized to engage in spaces and like that transactional model. So that like citing Frey right here is of like that banking model of education. Like I'm the expert because I have the PhD and I'm teaching the class and
Mhm.
I'm just going to pass down all this information that you're then going to regurgitate, but challenging them to actually critically examine these issues and think about these ways, even if we are good intention by changing the Mohawk Ironworkers Walk to the Wire Walk or whatever we want to call it.
Mhm.
Our intention's good, but then we're unintentionally erasing that direct contribution and then reinforcing a lot of these ideals that it was all these military white dudes that just were like tying ropes and throwing things together. So I think that that's really important. And we did this activity in the last class, and we had like the tree that was like the issue. And I was like, but what are the roots that are feeding into the issue? So people could clearly see the issue, and they're like, okay, yeah, like we don't have um, a good healthcare system, or like even access to technology was one of the issues. And people are like, how's that an issue? And that's like, let's actually take time and think about the roots, and let's keep asking questions. And as we ask more questions, the students really deepen down, and they're presenting ideas and thoughts that I hadn't even considered. But because we were able to create that space and engage in that process, that led to a greater outcome, I think. And I think that that's the critical moment. And I think that's the role we can play, is because we have these processes, but we don't always take the time to critically examine what it is that we're doing. Like why is it that like it's like the level 2 is the thing you have to do, and like all that. And it's like, yeah, I will argue that, yeah, you do need to know these rescues. You should have somebody that's confident in these skills, but like, what are those other factors? Are we bringing in some of those social factors as well, or are we so focused on like, let's do a cutaway rescue because it's cool, and like, and how
Mm-hmm.
often are we actually going to do that? Where I've had a lot more experiences where I've had to talk one-on-one with people where they've been triggered by something, or something emerged because they're in that vulnerable emotional state. And I've done pseudo counseling sessions up 60 feet in the air, because I've worked on courses that were very much in that that model of like, let's just go
Mm-hmm.
big for the sake of going big.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that that's really the critical piece there, is taking that time to examine, and not being so focused on, let's do the activity and let's move. Let's have that processing about that. Is how do you build that trust? Is if you come in trying to be like, I'm this expert. Like, I've done trainings where it's been always a white man, which is that in this space.
Mm-hmm.
But like, they'll tell these stories about, oh, I did this like really cool rescue, or like I did a swift water rescue course a few years ago, and everybody in the course was just like, I don't get anything out of that, because it was just the guy trying to talk about how cool he was and all these like really neat things. And we even like, I think we suggested a solution to something, and it was just kind of like, oh no, that's not in the book, or something like that. And it's like, well, I think this would work well because we had some different skills, and the group that was there, and it was just kind of this interesting framing. And then I think that's one of the reasons I build a strong relationship with the students I work with, or even when I'm teaching courses, or certifications and things like that, is because I do take that humble approach where I acknowledge that I do have some expertise, and I'm working on owning that.
What are what are some of the things you're excited about as we move forward into the industry? What's the like something you get excited about as you interact with more people at conferences and stuff? What's the excitement for you?
Yeah, no, I think the excitement really is that openness to taking that critical lens and thinking how we can move forward. So I know, even looking at some of the conference, what's going to be some of the workshops at AE this year, and even the workshops I participated in last year, the ones that seemed to have the most energy around them were on like those D and I topics. So, and people were really like, there's a great session with Project Venture, which is a really great Navajo organization that uses experiential learning with Navajo youth, to engage them in the process. And I think there were like 60 people in the room, and it was like just really cool to have that space. And they did a great job facilitating, where they got into the heart of like, this is colonization. We talked about some pretty heavy topics, but we're infusing some activities where we were like dancing with each other and things like that during the workshop. But then we were also talking about these topics. So I'm really excited about how we're said how we're like, I have the power, like how the industry as a whole is like highlighting some of these voices, but also like the interest of people who are in that quote unquote majority to engage in those, and really let themselves go and be vulnerable, so we can look inward at ourselves. Because I think that that's the most important point that I want to emphasize. And this is something I do with a lot of my work with like men's groups and things like that, is recognizing that it's not an attack on you as the person, it's an attack on the systems, and how we can challenge ourselves to heal and grow. Because everyone's harmed by these harmful systems. Um, and so we need to acknowledge that and be able to express that vulnerability and be our true selves in these spaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much for bringing this topic and that message to our audience.
Yeah, thank you.